Imagine living in a world where everything around you is collapsing. Roads are broken, farms are burned, taxes rise every year. Armies march through villages like storms, taking grain, taking sons, taking hope. For ordinary people in China at the start of the 7th century, peace felt like an old memory. The mighty Han Dynasty had fallen long ago, and after centuries of division, warlords, rival kingdoms, and endless bloodshed, people had grown used to survival instead of prosperity. Then came a dynasty that promised order, the Sui. At first, many believed the nightmare was ending. The Sui rulers reunited China and launched massive projects meant to bind the empire together. Canals were dug, walls repaired, roads built. On paper, it looked like rebirth, but greatness built too fast can become a burden. Those grand achievements demanded millions of laborers. Farmers were dragged from their fields. Families lost their providers. Taxes crushed villages already struggling to eat. Then came disastrous wars, especially against the Korean kingdom of Goguryeo. Campaign after campaign failed. Men died far from home. Supplies vanished. Anger spread like wildfire. Empires do not always fall with a single battle. Sometimes they collapse because ordinary people stop believing in them. By the year 618, the Sui dynasty was breaking apart. Rebellions erupted across the land. Governors ignored orders. Bandits roamed highways. Entire regions slipped beyond imperial control. In that chaos, one man saw opportunity. His name was Li Yuan. Li Yuan was not a peasant rebel or a wandering bandit chief. He was an aristocrat, a military commander, and a man who understood both war and politics. He knew the Sui throne had become weak, and he knew many powerful families were waiting to choose a new future. With careful timing, he moved toward Chang'an, one of the greatest cities in the world and the symbolic heart of imperial authority. Whoever held Chang'an did not merely occupy a city. They held the keys to legitimacy. When Li Yuan entered the city and declared a new dynasty, he took the title Emperor Gaozu. The Tang Dynasty had begun. But if this were only the story of a founder taking power, it would be impressive, not legendary. The true force that would transform China stood behind him, his son, Li Shimin. Li Shimin was brilliant, fearless, ambitious, and dangerous. He was the kind of man history remembers because he refused to remain in the shadows. During the wars that brought down the Sui and secured Tang rule, he proved himself again and again on the battlefield. He won victories, inspired troops, and outshined rivals. That included rivals within his own family. Royal families often look magnificent from a distance. Up close, they can be battlefields. Li Shimin was not the eldest son. That meant the throne was not automatically his. Other princes stood ahead of him, and in many dynasties that would have been the end of the story. But Li Shimin did not intend to wait quietly while lesser men inherited what he believed he had earned. In 626, one of the most dramatic moments in Chinese imperial history unfolded at the Xuanwu Gate. Li Shimin ambushed and killed his brothers in a violent struggle for succession. Soon after, his father stepped aside, and Li Shimin became emperor. History knows him as Emperor Taizong. To many listeners, that beginning sounds brutal, and it was. But ancient empires were not gentle places. The question is not whether rulers were ruthless. The question is what they built after seizing power. In Taizong's case, the answer would change the map of Asia. Many rulers believe strength means fear. They tighten punishments, expand courts, surround themselves with flatterers, and mistake obedience for stability. Taizong took another path. He had seen what destroyed the Sui: overreach, arrogance, and the exhaustion of the people. So instead of squeezing China harder, he began repairing it. He reduced the size of government. That may sound simple, but it mattered enormously. Bloated administrations consume wealth without creating it. Too many officials meant corruption, delays, competing interests, and endless waste. By streamlining the state, Taizong cut costs and improved efficiency. Fewer hands reached into the treasury. More resources could be used where they mattered. He strengthened systems for grain storage and food reserves. In a pre-modern empire, Famine was always waiting just beyond the horizon. A drought in one province, a flood in another, a failed harvest caused by locusts or frost. Any of these could kill thousands. Food reserves were not just economic policy. They were civilization insurance. If people can eat, they endure hardship. If they cannot, rebellion follows. He reinforced the civil service examination system, one of the most important institutions in Chinese history. For centuries, noble birth had opened doors. Powerful families expected influence as their inheritance. The exams offered another route: talent, discipline, education. A gifted young man from a lesser background could study the classics, pass the tests, and enter government. It was not perfectly fair, and wealth still helped, but compared with many societies of the era, it was revolutionary. Think about what that does to a nation. It tells people that learning matters. It turns scholarship into a path upward. It fills the bureaucracy with trained minds instead of merely well-born names. It encourages families to educate sons, preserve books, hire tutors, and value literacy. Over time, it shapes culture itself. Taizong also did something many rulers fail to do. He listened. Historical accounts describe him inviting criticism from ministers and valuing honest advice. He knew emperors live inside walls, surrounded by ceremony and praise. That can become a prison of illusions. Wise rulers seek voices willing to tell them uncomfortable truths. One famous minister, Wei Zheng, became known for blunt criticism. He challenged imperial decisions, warned against mistakes, and spoke with unusual boldness. Lesser rulers might have silenced him. Taizong kept him close. After Wei Zheng died, Taizong reportedly said that using bronze as a mirror lets one adjust clothing. Using history as a mirror reveals rise and fall, and using a person as a mirror reveals one's own faults. Whether every word is exact matters less than what the story represents. A ruler aware that power without reflection becomes blindness. Yet domestic reform was only half the story. Taizong looked beyond China's fields and cities toward the vast frontiers to the north and west. There, steppe confederations and nomadic powers controlled critical routes connecting East Asia with Central Asia and beyond. Those routes carried more than silk. They carried silver, horses, spices, glassware, ideas, religions, technologies, languages, and intelligence. Whoever controlled them shaped the flow of wealth across Eurasia. For centuries, Chinese dynasties had feared powerful nomadic confederations, especially the Turks. Fast cavalry from the steppe could strike hard, move quickly, and vanish into open land unfamiliar to sedentary armies. Many states try to defend against them with walls, tribute, diplomacy, or temporary alliances. Taizong planned something larger. He would defeat them, and then incorporate their strength into the Tang world. The Tang military system was highly organized. Earlier traditions of militia farmers evolved into a more capable structure supported by state planning and regional mobilization. Across the empire, military units were established with defined responsibilities. The central government kept tight control over deployment. Authority was not supposed to rest entirely in one general's hands. In a realm as large as China, that mattered. A powerful army could defend the empire or threaten the throne. Then came the campaign that announced Tang power to the world. In 630, Taizong sent the great General Li Jing against the Eastern Turks. Li Jing was no ordinary commander. He combined speed, discipline, deception, and nerve. Rather than lumber forward with an enormous force, he struck with astonishing mobility. Chinese cavalry pushed deep into enemy territory in a rapid offensive that shattered expectations. The Turkic leadership was caught off guard. Momentum collapsed. Resistance crumbled. The result was staggering. The Eastern Turkic Khaganate, one of the major powers of the steppe, fell. Large numbers surrendered. Even more remarkable than victory was what followed. Many defeated peoples accepted Tang overlordship. Taizong was recognized with titles reflecting steppe traditions, including the idea of a heavenly Khan. This was more than flattery. It meant Tang authority had crossed cultural boundaries. A Chinese emperor was now acknowledged in languages of the steppe. That matters because empires are strongest when they can speak in more than one political language. Rome ruled citizens and allies differently. Persia governed many peoples under layered systems. The Tang now showed similar flexibility. They were not simply forcing one identity everywhere. They were building a sphere of power broad enough to include different traditions. With the north stabilized, the west beckoned. Beyond China's frontier lay the oasis kingdoms of the Darime Basin, places like Kutcha, Kashgar, Khotan, and others. To modern eyes, these may sound remote, but in their time, they were jewels of the Silk Road. Caravans crossing deserts depended on them for water, markets, shelter, translators, guides, and taxes. Buddhist monks passed through. Merchants negotiated there. Diplomats watched each other carefully. Whoever controlled the oasis chain held a commercial artery of the ancient world. Tang armies and officials moved steadily into the region. Campaigns were fought, alliances made, protectorates established. Garrisons secured strategic points. Administrators collected revenue, mediated disputes, and represented imperial authority far from the Yellow River heartland. This was not raiding for glory. It was statecraft on a continental scale. To imagine the challenge, picture supplying troops across deserts, mountain corridors, and immense distances without engines, railways, or modern communications. Grain had to move. Horses needed fodder. Roads required maintenance. Messages traveled by courier. Local politics had to be understood. A commander might face not only enemies but climate, disease, and isolation. Yet the Tang repeatedly projected force across these spaces. And while armies marched abroad, something extraordinary was happening at home. Stability was returning. Fields were cultivated. Markets reopened. Taxation became more manageable. Confidence spread. When people believe tomorrow may be better than today, they plant orchards, repair houses, teach children, and invest in craft. Prosperity is not only wealth, it is trust in the future. Chang'an, the Tang capital, became the symbol of that future. Even before reaching its later zenith, the city stood among the wonders of the age. Planned on a grand grid, divided into wards, protected by walls, and anchored by palaces of immense scale, Chang'an was designed to express order. Streets were broad. Administrative compounds buzzed with officials. Markets drew goods from near and far. Processions of nobles, soldiers, monks, merchants, scholars, and envoys moved through a city that seemed to gather the world into itself. Imagine entering Chang'an as a traveler from distant lands. You pass through mighty gates into avenues wider than many roads elsewhere in the world. You hear accents from Central Asia, Korean speech, perhaps Persian traders bargaining, monks debating doctrine, scribes carrying documents, camel bells from caravans unloading foreign goods. You smell incense, cooked meats, lacquered wood, horses, perfume, paper, dust after rain. You realize quickly that this is not a provincial capital. This is the center of a system reaching across continents. And the Tang court wanted the world to know it. Envoys arrived from neighboring states. Tribute missions reinforced hierarchy and diplomacy. Some came seeking alliance, others trade access, others recognition. In the Tang worldview, the emperor stood at the center of civilized order. But practical politics mattered as much as ceremony. Gifts, titles, marriages, military cooperation, and negotiated status all played roles in maintaining influence. Taizong himself became famous beyond China. Later generations across East Asia remembered his reign as a model of capable rulership. Why? Because he achieved something rare. He combined military success, administrative reform, cultural confidence, and strategic flexibility at the same time. But no golden age appears fully formed. It is built day by day through choices that seem technical in the moment and historic in hindsight. A tax adjusted here, a corrupt official removed there, grain stored before drought, roads repaired before winter, a talented scholar promoted, a reckless war avoided, a decisive campaign launched at the right moment. History often remembers crowns and battles, But empires stand on thousands of invisible decisions. During these early Tang years, China was not merely recovering from collapse. It was being redesigned. The memory of chaos made order precious. The failures of the Sui taught restraint. The violence of succession taught the stakes of weakness. Taizong's own ruthless path to power may have sharpened his determination to govern effectively. He knew legitimacy won by force must be maintained by results. And results came. Agriculture expanded. Administration strengthened. Borders grew safer. Prestige rose. The Tang state became something neighbors had to reckon with. Sometimes fearfully, sometimes admiringly, often both. Across Asia, the message was clear. China had returned, stronger than before. Yet if part one has shown the rise, the next chapter reveals something even greater. Because military victory and internal reform were only the foundation. What came next would turn Tang China into the richest crossroads on earth. A civilization where Persians, Turks, Indians, Koreans, Japanese, Arabs, monks, poets, generals, and merchants all met under one imperial sky, and where the capital city would become the greatest urban center of its age. Just when the Tang had secured power, they were about to become legendary. By the time the early Tang emperors secured their throne, they had already achieved what many rulers spend lifetimes chasing. They had reunited a fractured land, restored order after chaos, defeated dangerous enemies, and made China respected again. For most dynasties, that would have been enough. But the Tang were not content with survival. They wanted supremacy, not only over territory, not only through armies, but through trade, culture, prestige, and influence so vast that people thousands of miles away would feel its gravity. To understand why the Tang became legendary, you have to understand one simple truth of the ancient world. Power did not come only from swords. It came from movement. Movement of goods, movement of ideas, movement of people, movement of knowledge. And the greatest highway of that movement was the Silk Road. Today the phrase sounds romantic, almost mythical. But in the Tang era, the Silk Road was a living network of routes stretching across deserts, mountains, grasslands, and seas. It connected East Asia to Central Asia, India, Persia, the Middle East, and the Mediterranean world. Along it traveled silk, horses, jade, silver, paper, perfumes, spices, glassware, gems, medicines, music, stories, religions, technologies, and rumors. A caravan leaving China might carry bolts of silk and return with precious stones, exotic animals, foreign instruments, and intelligence about kingdoms far beyond the horizon. For decades before the Tang, warfare and instability had made many of these routes dangerous or broken. Bandits preyed on merchants. Rival states fought over key corridors. Travel could mean ruin or death. But now a disciplined, ambitious empire had emerged with both the will and the military ability to reopen those arteries. The Tang did not simply wait for trade to happen. They engineered the conditions that made trade flourish. Across the western frontier and into Central Asia, they established protectorates, military colonies, garrisons, and administrative posts. Strategic oasis cities became more than rest stops. They became hubs of imperial power. Soldiers guarded roads. Officials registered caravans. Taxes were collected. Disputes were judged. Local rulers were monitored. Messages moved through relay systems. Safe passage became a service backed by the authority of the throne. That safety changed everything. A merchant will risk a storm. He may risk distance. He may risk markets rising and falling. But if he cannot trust the road, commerce dies. Under Tang protection, the road became trustworthy again. Caravans multiplied. Routes once feared became profitable. Fortunes were made not only by Chinese traders, but by Sogdians, Persians, Indians, Turks, Arabs, and countless intermediaries whose skills lay in language, negotiation, finance, and survival. Among the most famous of these were the Sogdians, Iranian-speaking merchants from Central Asia. If the Silk Road had master navigators, they were among them. They knew the markets of oasis towns, the customs of courts, the value of goods in distant cities, and the dangers hidden between them. Many spoke several languages. Many built family networks stretching across continents. Under the Tang, they thrived. Imagine a caravan arriving from the west. Camels loaded with silverware, glass cups, fragrant resins, woven carpets, carved ivory, and fine horses. Dust-covered traders carry letters from distant relatives, news of conflicts near Persia, and gossip from markets in Samarkand. They enter Tang territory knowing the roads are guarded and the markets hungry. Their profits could be enormous. And profits for merchants also meant revenue for the state. The Tang government taxed commerce, rented market spaces, regulated monopolies on valuable goods such as salt, and benefited from the sheer volume of exchange flowing through imperial lands. Wealth from trade helped finance armies, roads, canals, bureaucracy, palaces, temples, and the cultural brilliance for which the dynasty became famous. But the Tang vision went beyond land routes. They understood something equally important. The sea could carry empires too. China's southern ports expanded into global gateways. Ships sailed through Southeast Asian waters toward India, the Persian Gulf, and beyond. Foreign merchants arrived in large numbers. Harbors such as Guangzhou became crowded with languages. Warehouses, dock workers, customs officials, sailors, translators, money changers, and brokers. Spices from South Asia, aromatics from Arabia, pearls, ivory, rare woods, and luxury goods entered Chinese markets. Chinese ceramics, silk, lacquerware, and manufactured goods moved outward in return. Think of how remarkable this was in the 7th and 8th centuries. While many regions remained locally focused, Tang China was tied into a transcontinental economic system by both land and sea. It was not isolated greatness. It was connected greatness. And nowhere did that connection become more visible than Chang'an. If trade routes were the veins of the Tang world, Chang'an was the beating heart. The city stood as one of the largest urban centers on Earth. Its scale alone astonished visitors. Massive walls enclosed carefully planned districts laid out on a grid. Broad avenues ran between wards. Government compounds, noble estates, markets, workshops, temples, gardens, barracks, and palaces filled the urban landscape. The imperial palace complex itself occupied extraordinary space, a physical statement that the ruler sat at the center of order. But size was only the beginning. Many large cities in history have been crowded, rich, or powerful. Few have also been cosmopolitan in the deepest sense. Chang'an was not merely Chinese people living in a Chinese city. It was a meeting place of civilizations. Walk through one of its markets and you might hear Chinese, Turkic languages, Persian, Sanskrit, Korean, Japanese, Tibetan, and more. A monk from India debates scripture with a Chinese scholar. A Central Asian musician performs for nobles. A Korean student studies classics in hopes of passing examinations. Japanese envoys observe court rituals to bring models home. Persian traders sell silver vessels and dyed textiles. A foreign groom leads magnificent horses prized by the military. Street vendors sell food seasoned with flavors once considered exotic. The markets themselves were famous institutions. The Eastern market and Western market became centers of regulated commerce where goods from around the world could be bought and sold. Officials oversaw weights, measures, and order. Market bells marked schedules. Warehouses stored imports. Brokers connected buyers and sellers. In an age without stock exchanges or modern logistics, these markets represented sophisticated commercial organization. Then there was religion. The Tang era is remembered as one of the most religiously diverse periods in Chinese history. Buddhism was deeply influential, with monasteries, scriptures, art, and pilgrimage networks flourishing. Taoism enjoyed imperial patronage at various times. Confucian values continued to shape administration and education. But imported faiths also found space. Zoroastrian communities from Persia maintained fire temples. Nestorian Christians established churches. Manichaean groups appeared. Muslim communities formed through trade and diplomacy. Jewish merchants are also recorded in broader networks of exchange. For significant periods, Tang China was remarkably open to spiritual traditions from abroad. This tolerance was not always perfect or permanent, but it was real enough to leave a lasting mark. Why would an empire allow such diversity? Partly confidence. Strong civilizations often feel less threatened by difference. Partly pragmatism. Foreign merchants and specialists brought wealth and useful knowledge. Partly curiosity. The Tang elite lived in a world energized by exchange, where new music, fashions, ideas, and techniques carried prestige. That openness transformed everyday culture. Fashion changed. Elite clothing styles absorbed Central Asian influences. Riding attire, boots, fitted garments, and decorative motifs reflected tastes from the steppe and beyond. Women of the Tang court are often depicted wearing bold, elegant garments that reveal a society more outward-looking than later conservative eras. Music changed too. The Tang court famously supported multiple official musical traditions, some rooted in Chinese heritage, others imported or adapted from foreign lands. Instruments traveled across borders. Rhythms mixed. Performances featured dancers from Central Asia whose styles captivated audiences. Banquets became theaters of empire, where culture itself displayed the reach of the dynasty. Cuisine évoluait. New ingredients, spices, fruits, and methods entered Chinese kitchens. Trade does not only enrich treasuries, it changes taste. What begins as foreign novelty can become beloved custom. Art flourished in this atmosphere of abundance and contact. Painters experimented with landscapes, portraits, horses, court scenes, and Buddhist themes. Craftsmen refined ceramics, metalwork, textiles, and lacquer. Sculptors carved devotional images of stunning grace. The famous three-color glazed pottery associated with the Tang became celebrated for its beauty and technical sophistication. And then there was poetry. If Chang'an was the capital of empire, it was also a capital of words. The Tang period is often called the golden age of Chinese poetry. This was not an accident. A wealthy, literate, connected society creates audiences, patrons, and ambition. The civil service examinations encouraged mastery of language. Scholars competed not only in governance, but in expression. Officials traveled, served in distant provinces, suffered exile, gained promotions, mourned losses, admired mountains, drank with friends, and wrote about it all. Later generations would revere Tang poets as giants. Li Bai, dazzling and romantic, became associated with wine, moonlight, friendship, and the freedom of wandering. Du Fu wrote with emotional depth about war, hardship, moral duty, and the suffering of ordinary people. Wang Wei blended poetry, painting, and spiritual reflection into works of serene beauty. They were not alone. Thousands wrote. An entire civilization was speaking in verse. Imagine living in a world where poems were not niche entertainment, but social currency, moral reflection, memory, and art woven into elite life. A successful line could outlive armies. The Tang state also benefited from technology and administration sophisticated for its time. Woodblock printing began to spread more widely, making texts easier to reproduce than hand copying alone. Paper, already a transformative Chinese invention from earlier centuries, continued its expansion across Eurasia. Better record keeping, broader access to texts, and more efficient communication strengthened both culture and governance. Roads and courier networks tied the empire together. Messages could move faster than before across great distances. Grain transport through canal systems linked productive agricultural regions with political centers. The state's ability to feed cities and armies depended on logistics as much as on laws or courage. This is a key point often missed in stories of great empires. Glory rests on administration. A poem survives because paper exists. A city thrives because grain arrives. A frontier holds because horses are fed. A merchant invests because roads are guarded. A talented student rises because exams are organized. Behind visible brilliance lies invisible structure. The Tang excelled at both. They could impress with spectacle. Vast palaces, triumphant armies, bustling markets, glittering courts. But they also managed the machinery underneath. Taxation, transport, appointments, military oversight, law, archives, food supply, and provincial coordination. And because of that combination, people far beyond China measured themselves against Tang standards. Japan sent missions to study Tang institutions, architecture, writing systems, religion, and statecraft. Korean states interacted deeply with Tang power and culture. Central Asian rulers negotiated, resisted, or cooperated depending on circumstance. Even distant societies knew of China through the movement of goods and stories. When later generations across East Asia imagined a model of sophisticated civilization, they often looked back to the Tang. Yet all golden ages contain hidden tensions. The more open a society becomes, the more it depends on stability. The richer trade grows, the more there is to fight over. The farther borders extend, the more expensive they become to defend. The more talented generals rise, the more dangerous they may become. The more magnificent the capital, the easier it is to forget how fragile greatness can be. For now, however, the Tang still seemed unstoppable. The roads were busy. The markets were full. Chang'an shone like a star visible across continents. Scholars wrote, monks traveled, merchants prospered, armies guarded frontiers. Foreign envoys bowed before imperial ceremony. China was not merely powerful. It was fashionable, admired, imitated. But history is never still. Soon, the Tang world would face one of the most extraordinary figures in all Chinese history. A woman who rose from the inner palace to seize the throne itself, overturn centuries of expectation, and rule as emperor in her own name. Many hated her, many feared her, but no one could ignore her. And after her reign, the dynasty would reach an even greater height, just before the first cracks began to appear beneath the golden surface. In every great empire, there are moments when the impossible suddenly becomes real. A border once thought secure collapses overnight. A small rebellion becomes a revolution. A forgotten general changes history. And sometimes, in a world built almost entirely for man, a woman rises through layers of power so completely that she does what no one believed could ever be done. That woman was Wu Zetian. To understand how extraordinary her story is, you have to imagine the world she entered. The Tang court was dazzling on the surface. Silk robes, carved halls, rituals, music, brilliant officials, foreign envoys, endless ceremony. But beneath that elegance, the palace was one of the most dangerous places in the empire. Every smile could hide ambition. Every marriage could shift alliances. Every child born to the imperial family might become a future struggle for succession. Courtiers whispered, factions formed, servants carried secrets, and fortunes could rise or disappear in a single season. Wu Zetian entered that world not as a ruler, not as a noble sovereign, but as a young concubine in the court of Emperor Taizong. In theory, this should have defined the limits of her life. Concubines could gain favor, bear children, influence moods, but they did not become emperors. They did not rewrite the rules of civilization. When Taizong died, palace custom should have ended her political relevance. Many imperial consorts without sons were expected to retire to Buddhist institutions. Their connection to power was supposed to be over. But history rarely obeys expectations. Wu returned to the palace orbit and caught the attention of the next emperor, Gaozong, Taizong's son. From there, her rise accelerated. She became consort, then empress, and gradually one of the most influential people in the empire. Gaozong suffered from recurring illness, and as his health weakened, Wu's role expanded. She reviewed documents, made appointments, handled state matters, and built alliances. Officials who underestimated her learned quickly that intelligence can be sharper than rank. Traditional hostile accounts painted her as ruthless, manipulative, and cruel. Some accused her of eliminating rivals through intrigue and terror. Ancient courts everywhere generated such accusations, especially against powerful women who threatened established norms. It is likely she could be severe. Almost every successful ruler of the age was. But it is equally clear that reducing her to palace villainy misses the larger truth. She was a highly capable political operator who mastered one of the most complex governments in the world. When Gaozong died in 683, Wu initially ruled through her sons. That alone was significant, but she went further. In 690, she took an unprecedented step. She declared herself emperor in her own right and founded a new dynasty, the Zhou. Not empress, emperor. That distinction matters. She was not presenting herself merely as the wife or mother of a ruler. She claimed the highest office itself. In more than 2,000 years of imperial Chinese history, no other woman would do the same on that scale. The reaction among conservative elites was fierce. Many Confucian thinkers believed society depended on hierarchy, ritual order, and clearly defined gender roles. Wu's reign shattered assumptions at the very center of that worldview. Yet outrage alone could not remove her. She held the machinery of state, the loyalty of key supporters, and enough legitimacy through results to govern. And govern she did. Under Wu Zetian, the empire remained strong. Administration continued. Frontiers were defended. Trade flowed. The economy prospered. She promoted officials through merit more aggressively than some predecessors, weakening old aristocratic monopolies. That won support among talented men from families outside the traditional elite. If noble birth no longer guaranteed advancement, many ambitious scholars now had reason to support the regime. She also elevated Buddhism as a source of legitimacy. Religious imagery and prophecy were used to frame her rule as cosmically sanctioned. In ancient politics, symbols mattered. If heaven favored the ruler, opposition became more difficult to justify. One of the lasting artistic legacies associated with her era is the continuation of monumental Buddhist patronage, including works at the Longmen Grottos. Massive stone carvings, serene and majestic, reflected both devotion and imperial grandeur. They were spiritual statements and political ones at the same time. What made Wu remarkable was not that she was kind or modern in some idealized sense. She was remarkable because she understood power deeply. She knew institutions matter more than sentiment. She knew legitimacy can be built through competence. She knew the common people cared less about elite outrage than about taxes, grain, order, and opportunity. When she was finally removed in 705, elderly and weakened, she left behind one of the most debated reputations in Chinese history. Some remembered tyranny. Others remembered effectiveness. Either way, no one forgot her. After her reign, the Tang Dynasty was restored. And then something extraordinary happened. Instead of collapsing from disruption, the empire entered an even greater age. Under Emperor Xuanzong in the early 8th century, Tang China reached what many historians describe as its absolute zenith. Population grew enormously. Agriculture expanded. Cities swelled. Trade intensified. Culture dazzled. The state appeared stable, rich, and supremely confident. Imagine standing in Chang'an at this moment. The avenues are crowded from dawn to night. Caravans from the west unload goods beside wagons from the Chinese countryside. Government messengers ride hard through gates, carrying sealed orders. Students recite classical texts in preparation for examinations that might change their lives. Noble households host banquets lit by lanterns, filled with music from across Asia. Temples burn incense. Markets overflow with fabrics, ceramics, tea, spices, books, metalwork, and rare luxuries. Foreign visitors marvel at the scale of the city and the complexity of its administration. The Tang court at its height projected magnificence with purpose. Ceremony was theater, but strategic theater. It reminded allies, rivals, and subjects alike that they were dealing with a civilization of immense resources and confidence. Meanwhile, the economy pulsed with energy. The Grand Canal and associated transport networks linked grain-rich southern regions with northern political centers. This was one of the most important logistical achievements in the empire. Great capitals cannot eat prestige. They eat food. Moving grain efficiently meant feeding officials, soldiers, artisans, laborers, and millions of urban residents. It reduced the risk of shortages and tied regions into a common economic system. Markets expanded internally as well as internationally. Rural producers sold surpluses. Craftsmen specialized. Merchants connected provinces. Tax revenues supported the bureaucracy and military. Wealth circulated through both elite luxury consumption and everyday exchange. Technological and intellectual life also continued to flourish. Printing methods advanced gradually, helping preserve and spread texts. Scholarship remained central to official culture. Poets wrote some of the most enduring verses in world literature. Painters refined landscapes that would shape artistic traditions for centuries. Ceramic production improved in quality and style. Medicine absorbed influences and observations from multiple traditions. Astronomy and calendrical science received ongoing attention because timekeeping was both practical and symbolic for imperial rule. The Tang world was rich not only in goods, but in confidence. This confidence can be seen in social life too. Elite women in the Tang period often appear in art and literature with a degree of visibility and cultural presence that later eras sometimes narrowed. Fashion was bold. Horse riding by women appears in some depictions. Urban entertainment was lively. The atmosphere of the age, while never equal or free in a modern sense, was comparatively expansive. And yet beneath this brilliance, structural problems were forming. This is how many great powers decline, not through obvious weakness, but through strengths that become overstretched. The empire's frontiers were vast. Defending them required large armies stationed far from the capital. To manage these zones, the Tang increasingly relied on regional military governors known as Jidushi. These commanders oversaw troops, logistics, local administration, and often taxation in their territories. At first, this was practical. A distant frontier cannot wait months for every instruction from the capital. Local authority allows speed and flexibility, but authority, once granted, can grow roots. Some Jidushi became immensely powerful. They controlled seasoned soldiers loyal to them personally. They managed revenue streams. They built local networks. In effect, they began to resemble semi-independent rulers inside the empire. The center still glittered, but parts of the periphery were learning how to live without it. Then came another warning from the west. In 751, Tang forces encountered the Abbasid Caliphate and its allies at the Battle of Talas in Central Asia. The battle later gained fame for many reasons, including traditions about the transmission of papermaking westward, though details are debated. Militarily, it was not the immediate destruction of Tang power sometimes imagined in popular retellings. But symbolically, it marked a limit. Tang expansion into Central Asia had met another major imperial force. The easy outward momentum of earlier decades was over. Still, the empire remained strong enough that few would predict disaster was near. That is often when disaster strikes. Among the most powerful frontier commanders was a man named Lushan. He was of mixed background, often described as having Turkic and Sogdian connections. His career itself reflected Tang cosmopolitanism. The empire had long promoted talented non-Han figures in military roles. Ability mattered, and Lushan rose high through that system. He commanded major forces in the northeast and enjoyed favor at court. Some saw him as loyal. Others saw ambition. By the time suspicions became urgent, it was too late. In 755, Lushan rebelled. The scale of the threat was immense. This was not a local disturbance or peasant riot. He led battle-hardened frontier troops, experienced and dangerous. His armies advanced rapidly. Cities fell. Panic spread. The unthinkable happened. The capital itself was taken. Emperor Xuanzong fled. Pause for a moment and consider what that means. The ruler of the most magnificent empire on earth, patron of a golden age, guardian of immense wealth and prestige, forced to run from his own capital while rebel forces marched through the heart of his realm. The rebellion would last for years and devastate the dynasty. Regions were ravaged, populations displaced, economies shattered, tax systems broken, trust in the center deeply damaged. Though the Tang eventually survived and the rebellion was suppressed, survival is not the same as recovery. The empire after Lushan was not the empire before him. This is one of history's cruel patterns. It can take generations to build greatness and only a few years to break the systems that sustain it. The Tang court returned, but much had changed. Regional military governors became even harder to control. Frontier territories were lost or weakened. Rivals, such as Tibet, expanded influence in contested zones. Revenue shrank. The old balance between central authority and provincial power had been shattered. And something else changed too. Confidence. The open, cosmopolitan energy that once defined the Tang began to fade under pressure. In times of fear, societies often become suspicious of the foreign influences they once celebrated. Diversity that looked glamorous during prosperity can become a target during crisis. That shift would shape the final century of the dynasty. Yet before we enter the age of fragmentation, rebellions, massacres, and collapse, it is worth remembering what had just been lost. Not simply a throne or a city, but a rare historical moment when military strength, cultural brilliance, administrative sophistication, and global openness existed together at astonishing scale. The Tang had touched its highest peak, and now it had begun to fall. When people imagine the fall of great empires, they often picture one final battle, a dramatic last stand, a city burning in a single night, a king defeated on the field, and everything ending at once. But most empires do not die that way. They die slowly. They survive disaster, then weaken. They rebuild partially, then fracture again. Institutions hollow out. Trust disappears. Local powers rise. Wealth shrinks. Violence becomes normal. By the time the official ending arrives, the true empire has already been gone for years. That was the fate of the Tang Dynasty after the Lushan Rebellion. The rebellion itself had been catastrophic, but its deeper damage was political. Before it, the Tang state had projected confidence from the center outward. After it, power increasingly flowed the other way. Regional commanders, provincial elites, and local strongmen learned that the capital could be challenged, abandoned, and negotiated with. The aura of invincibility was broken. The court still existed. Emperors still sat on the throne. Rituals continued. Decrees were issued. But in many provinces, reality no longer matched ceremony. The Jadushi, the military governors originally created to defend the frontiers, became some of the most powerful figures in the land. Many controlled their own armies, tax bases, and appointments. Some passed influence through family networks. Others ignored imperial orders when inconvenient. In theory, they served the emperor. In practice, many ruled their territories like autonomous states. Imagine being a farmer or merchant in this later Tang world. The name of the dynasty still commands respect, but what matters to your daily life may be the local commander nearby, not the emperor far away. Whose taxes do you pay? Whose soldiers pass through your village? Whose law is enforced? Increasingly, those answers were local. Meanwhile, the empire's outer zones became harder to hold. The Tibetans expanded during periods of Tang weakness and challenged Chinese control in western regions. Strategic sections of the Silk Road changed hands or became contested. Once secure routes grew uncertain. Trade did not vanish, but stability declined. Every insecure road means fewer caravans, higher costs, and less revenue. This matters because the Tang state had been built partly on connectivity. Wealth flowed through movement, grain, taxes, trade goods, people, information. When movement becomes dangerous or fragmented, the whole machine strains. At court, factional struggles intensified. Eunuchs gained increasing influence over military and political affairs, particularly because emperors often relied on palace insiders to counterbalance outside officials and generals. This, too, is a familiar imperial pattern. When rulers fear provincial warlords, they empower court figures. When they fear court figures, they rely on generals. Each solution creates a new problem. Some emperors after the Golden Age were capable. Others were weak, distracted, or trapped by circumstance. Even talented rulers found it difficult to reverse structural decline. Once provinces accumulate autonomy, once revenues fall, once armies owe loyalty elsewhere, reform becomes far harder than conquest ever was. And then the social atmosphere began to change. Earlier Tang China had become famous for cosmopolitan openness. Foreign merchants prospered. Imported religions found space. Styles, music, and ideas crossed borders. But periods of instability often generate suspicion. People ask who belongs, who profited, who can be blamed. Outsiders become easy targets. In 760, during the turmoil following the Lushan era, foreign merchants were massacred in Yangzhou. It was a chilling sign that the confidence of the old Tang order had given way to fear and volatility. Later, in 878 to 879, another horrific massacre took place in Guangzhou during rebellion, where large numbers of foreign merchants, including Arabs, Persians, Jews, Christians, and others in trading communities, were killed. Exact figures in medieval sources are often debated, but the scale of violence was unmistakable. Think about what this meant symbolically. A dynasty once celebrated as the meeting point of civilizations had become a place where international communities could be slaughtered in chaos. The openness that helped make the Tang great was being replaced by fragmentation and distrust. Religious tolerance also narrowed. In 845, a major suppression of Buddhism and other foreign associated religions took place under Emperor Wuzong. Thousands of monasteries and temples were closed or destroyed. Monks and nuns were forced back into lay life, and temple lands were seized. Motives included economic pressure, political control, and ideological reaction. Why target monasteries? Because religious institutions had accumulated land, wealth, influence, and tax exemptions. In a financially stressed state, temple property looked like a solution. Yet the campaign also marked a turning point in the cultural atmosphere. The broad pluralism of earlier centuries was fading. Then nature joined the crisis. No empire, however powerful, can command the weather. Floods struck, droughts came, harvests failed, famine spread. In agrarian societies, natural disasters are never only environmental events. They become political tests. Can the government transport grain? Can taxes be reduced? Can order be maintained? Can desperate people survive the winter? When the answer is no, rebellion follows. In 858, severe flooding affected major systems, including the Grand Canal network, damaging transport and livelihoods. Later decades saw further hardship. In the 870s, famine and social distress deepened across large regions. Hungry people do not care about elegant court ceremony. They care about bread, seed, and survival. Out of this misery rose one of the final great blows against the dynasty, the Huang Chao Rebellion. Huang Chao was not born to rule. He emerged from a world of frustration, hardship, and exclusion. What began as revolt expanded into a massive uprising drawing in peasants, smugglers, disaffected soldiers, and all those crushed by a failing order. By the 870s and early 880s, his forces swept across vast areas. Then the unthinkable happened again. The capital, Chang'an, the city that had once dazzled the world, was captured and sacked in 881. Pause and imagine the emotional weight of that moment. This was not just another city. This was the heart of Tang civilization, the symbol of imperial greatness, the crossroads of continents, the stage of poets and emperors, the place whose avenues had once represented order itself. Now it was taken by rebels and ravaged by war. The dynasty would continue in name after Huang Chao, but only as a shell. Regional powers dominated politics. Court authority depended on whichever military faction held advantage at the moment. Emperors became increasingly vulnerable to manipulation. The state that once commanded Asia now struggled to command itself. Finally, in 907, the Tang Dynasty officially ended. A warlord named Zhu Wan, who had risen amid the chaos of the late Tang, forced the last emperor to abdicate. With that, nearly 3 centuries of Tang rule came to a close. China then entered the era known as the 5 Dynasties and 10 Kingdoms, a period of fragmentation in the north and multiple regional states elsewhere. Dynasties rose and fell quickly. Alliances shifted. Borders changed. It would take more than half a century before broader reunification emerged under the Song Dynasty. And yet here is the extraordinary part. The Tang died, but Tang greatness did not. Some empires vanish almost completely, leaving ruins and scattered memory. The Tang instead became a benchmark. Later Chinese dynasties compared themselves to Tang achievements. Scholars looked back to Tang poetry as a literary summit. Artists drew inspiration from Tang aesthetics. Statesmen studied Tang institutions. Military thinkers remembered Tang campaigns. Urban planners admired Tang Chang'an. East Asian neighbors preserved influences shaped during Tang contact. The dynasty became not only history, but ideal. Even the name Tang traveled. In some overseas communities and languages, China itself became associated with the Tang. That is how deeply its prestige reached. So, was the Tang dynasty the most powerful Chinese dynasty? The answer depends on how we measure power. If we measure raw territory, the Yuan under the Mongols ruled larger lands. But the Yuan was founded by conquerors from outside the traditional Chinese dynastic line. If we measure economic innovation, the Song Dynasty later achieved astonishing commercial and technological sophistication. But the Song lacked the same scale of military dominance and frontier reach. If we measure foundational identity and long civilizational influence, the Han Dynasty stands as a giant. Yet the Tang matched or surpassed it in cosmopolitan prestige and global connectedness. If we measure the combination of all factors at once, territory, military force, administrative competence, urban magnificence, cultural brilliance, international prestige, and openness to the wider world, the Tang has one of the strongest claims of all. For long stretches of its history, Tang China was arguably the most advanced, wealthy, and influential civilization on Earth. Its armies rode across deserts and mountains to reshape Asia. Its merchants linked oceans and caravan roads. Its capital gathered peoples from across continents. Its poets wrote verses memorized more than 1,000 years later. Its institutions rewarded talent, managed complexity, and inspired neighbors. Its rulers, whether admired or feared, governed at a scale few societies could imagine. And its decline offers lessons just as powerful as its rise. A state can be rich and still become brittle. Military decentralization can solve one problem while creating another. Openness can generate greatness, yet require confidence to sustain. Prosperity can hide structural weakness. Rebellion can destroy in years what took generations to build. Symbols endure longer than systems. Most of all, the Tang reminds us that history's greatest moments are never permanent. There was a time when Chang'an seemed eternal, when the Silk Road pulsed under Tang protection, when foreign envoys crossed mountains to stand before the emperor, when scholars believed civilization had found its highest form. Then it changed. But because it changed, we remember it. Because what rises so high and falls so far leaves a mark deeper than ordinary kingdoms ever could. That is why the Tang Dynasty still matters. Not just as an ancient Chinese empire, but as one of humanity's clearest examples of what power can achieve when guided by vision, strengthened by talent, enriched by openness, and undone by the very forces it once mastered. And centuries later, when people speak of China at its absolute peak, they still return to the same name, the Tang. When a great empire falls, people far away often imagine silence afterward. They imagine empty palaces, abandoned roads, ruined cities, and history simply stopping. But that is not how civilizations work. Civilizations do not vanish the moment a dynasty ends. They bend, they fracture, they suffer. Then, if the foundations are strong enough, they rise again in a new form. That is exactly what happened after the Tang Dynasty collapsed in 907. The banners of Tang were lowered. The emperors were gone. The court that had once commanded armies from Korea to Central Asia was no more. The city of Chang'an, once the beating heart of the world, had lost much of its old brilliance. The Silk Road was no longer under one confident hand. Provincial warlords ruled like kings. Old loyalties shattered. For many ordinary people, it must have felt like the sky itself had broken. But for listeners today, this is where the story becomes deeply relatable. Because every person knows what it means when one chapter of life ends. A job ends. A relationship ends. A dream collapses. A city changes. A family struggles. You look around and think everything that once felt certain is gone. The Tang collapse was that feeling, on the scale of a civilization. And just like in real life, the end of one chapter was not the end of the story. After the Tang came a chaotic age known as the 5 dynasties and 10 kingdoms. In the north, dynasties rose and fell rapidly, sometimes lasting only years. In the south, regional kingdoms governed prosperous lands with their own courts, armies, and ambitions. Maps changed constantly. Alliances shifted. Generals betrayed rulers. New states claimed old legitimacy. It was confusing even for the people living through it. Imagine waking up in such a world. Your father paid taxes to one dynasty. You pay taxes to another. Your son may serve a third. Coins change. Officials change. Laws change. Yet the fields still need planting. Children still need feeding. Life continues even when politics becomes madness. That is one of history's most human truths. Ordinary people carry civilization through chaos. Farmers still farmed. Craftsmen still worked. Teachers still taught. Merchants still traded. Families still hoped. While rulers fought over crowns, millions of nameless people kept the world alive. And from that unstable world, a new leader emerged. His name was Zhao Guangyin. He began as a military commander during the later Zhou, one of the short-lived northern dynasties. Unlike many ambitious generals in history, Zhao did not simply win battles. He understood exhaustion. He understood that China had seen enough blood. Generals could keep fighting forever, but the people wanted order. In 960, Zhao Guangyin was proclaimed emperor in a famous military coup and founded the Song Dynasty. History remembers him as Emperor Taizu of Song. But what made him remarkable was not only that he seized power. Many men had done that. What made him remarkable was what he did next. He looked at the disasters of the Tang and learned the lesson clearly. The Tang had been magnificent, but in its final age, powerful regional generals became too strong. Frontier commanders built personal armies. Military governors acted like kings. Rebellion destroyed the center. If China was to survive and flourish again, that pattern had to be broken. So the Song founders made a radical choice. They weakened the military elite and strengthened civilian government. Generals were rewarded, honored, and retired from dangerous concentrations of power. Authority was drawn back toward the center. Scholar officials gained influence. Administration, law, taxation, education, and bureaucracy became the pillars of the new dynasty. It was a different model from the Tang. The Tang had said, power through expansion, cavalry, frontiers, and imperial grandeur. The Song would increasingly say, power through governance, wealth, technology, learning, and internal strength. This shift is incredibly relatable even now. Some people win through force. Others win through intelligence. Some lives are built through dominance. Others through discipline. Some nations chase glory. Others build systems. The Song Dynasty chose systems. And those systems transformed China. At first, reunification was gradual. Rival states in the south were absorbed through diplomacy, pressure, and selective warfare. Some surrendered peacefully. Others resisted. But compared with the endless chaos before, the Song project felt like sunrise after a storm. Cities revived. Roads became safer. Trade expanded. Confidence returned. But the Song world would not simply copy the Tang. It would become something new, If the Tang was the age of empire on horseback, the Song would become the age of the marketplace. Commerce during the Song exploded to levels that astonish historians even today. Markets linked villages to towns, towns to cities, cities to river networks to seas. Merchants moved grain, tea, ceramics, iron goods, textiles, books, medicines, and luxury products across enormous distances. Wealth no longer flowed only from conquest or land taxes. It flowed through exchange. And with commerce came urban life on a breathtaking scale. Some Song cities became among the largest on earth. Kaifeng, the northern Song capital, grew into a vibrant metropolis packed with shops, restaurants, theaters, temples, workshops, bridges, inns, tea houses, and crowded streets alive day and night. Pause and picture it. A food seller shouting for customers beside a bridge. Scholars debating politics over tea. Children chasing each other through alleys. Lanterns reflecting on canal water. Boatmen unloading cargo at dawn. Silk merchants bargaining loudly. Street performers drawing crowds. Officials carried in sedan chairs. Bookshops selling printed texts to ambitious students. Doctors advertising remedies. Travelers from distant provinces staring in amazement. This was not a fading civilization after the Tang. This was reinvention. And then came one of the most revolutionary changes in human history. Paper money. The Song Dynasty became the first government in world history to issue large-scale paper currency. Think about how extraordinary that is. For thousands of years, wealth had mint metal, coins of bronze, silver, gold. Heavy, limited, physical. Now value could move through printed notes backed by trust and institutions. That sounds modern because it is modern. When you tap a card today, transfer money online, or trust numbers in an account, you're living in a world shaped by the same idea. Value can exist through systems people believe in. The Song did not invent modern banking as we know it, but they moved humanity dramatically closer to it. And they did not stop there. Printing expanded far beyond earlier centuries. Books became more available. Knowledge spread faster. Confucian classics, histories, technical manuals, poetry, philosophy, texts once rare could reach wider audiences. Education deepened. Examinations became even more central. Families invested in study because success in learning could change a family's destiny. Imagine a father in a small town staying awake by lamplight while his son memorizes texts. They're not nobles. They do not command armies. But if the son succeeds in exams, he could enter government, earn prestige, lift the family's future. That dream drove generations. The Song world also became one of astonishing invention. Gunpowder formulas advanced. The compass was increasingly used in navigation. Shipbuilding improved. Iron production surged. Agricultural techniques spread. New rice varieties helped feed growing populations. Engineering flourished. Scientific observation matured. The Song may not always have looked as militarily intimidating as the Tang, but in terms of practical innovation, it was centuries ahead of much of the world. And yet, like every age, it had its price. Because while the Song became rich, educated, urban, and inventive, it faced dangerous neighbors to the north. The Khitan Liao, then the Jurchen Jin, and later the Mongols all challenged Song security. The dynasty often paid for peace, negotiated from caution, and fought defensive wars. Critics later called the Song weak. But that judgment can be too simple. Is a society weak because it values books over boasting? Is a ruler weak because he chooses prosperity over endless war? Is survival through strategy less impressive than glory through destruction? These are not only historical questions. They are personal ones too. Many people mistake noise for strength. Many mistake aggression for confidence. Many think the loudest person in the room is the strongest. History often says otherwise. The Song endured for centuries. It created wealth, ideas, art, and institutions that outlasted many conquerors. It proved that a civilization does not need to resemble its former golden age to be great. This is why the story after the Tang matters so much. Because when something magnificent is lost, we often believe nothing equally meaningful can follow. We compare every future chapter to the old peak. We say, it will never be like before. And sometimes that is true. It will not be like before. It may become something else. The Tang could never return exactly as it was. Its cavalry empire, cosmopolitan Chang'an, Silk Road supremacy, and frontier grandeur belonged to their age. But from its ashes came another form of greatness. More commercial, more technological, more bureaucratic, more inwardly developed, yet still brilliant. That is the deeper lesson connecting Tang to Song. Human strength is not only the power to rise once. It is the power to rise differently. Empires know this. Nations know this. Families know this. Individuals know this. You lose one version of your life. You build another. You lose certainty. You create wisdom. You lose momentum. You develop discipline. You lose an old identity. You discover a stronger one. China after the Tang did exactly that. The roads changed. The capitals changed. The threats changed. The style of greatness changed. But civilization continued. And the story was far from over. Because one day, from the northern grasslands beyond all these dynasties, a new force would emerge unlike anything the world had ever seen. A people who would ride faster than empires could think. A storm that would swallow kingdoms from Korea to Europe. And when that storm reached China, even the brilliant Song Dynasty would face the greatest challenge in its history. For centuries, Chinese dynasties looked north with a mixture of caution, fear, and respect. Beyond the settled farmlands, beyond walled cities and canal networks, beyond bureaucrats and tax registers, stretched the great grasslands of Inner Asia. To agricultural empires, the steppe could seem empty from a distance. But it was never empty. It was alive with movement. Horse herds thundered across open plains. Tribes migrated with the seasons. Warriors learned to ride almost as soon as they could walk. Children grew up in a world where weather could kill, distance meant little, and survival demanded toughness. Political loyalties were fluid. Alliances could change quickly, and leadership belonged not to those with ancient titles, but to those who could command respect. Again and again in history, powers from the steppe reshaped the settled civilizations around them. Some traded, some raided, some founded dynasties, some vanished. But in the 13th century, one leader would unite the steppe more completely than any before him, and unleash a force that changed the entire world. His birth name was Temujin. He did not begin life surrounded by luxury or certainty. He knew hardship early. His father died when he was young. His family was abandoned by their clan. Hunger, danger, and betrayal were not political concepts to him. They were childhood realities. He learned that status can disappear overnight and that survival depends on resilience. That is one reason his story still feels relatable today. Many people imagine great leaders begin with clear paths and guaranteed success. History often says the opposite. Some of the most transformative figures begin in instability. They know what it means to lose before they know what it means to win. Temujin rose slowly through alliances, battles, marriages, loyalty, revenge, and extraordinary political skill. He rewarded competence, punished betrayal, and built coalitions among tribes long divided by rivalry. He did not simply conquer enemies. He reorganized society. In 1206, he was proclaimed Genghis Khan. The title signaled more than kingship. It marked the birth of a new political order, the Mongol Empire. What made the Mongols terrifying was not only courage. Many armies had courage. It was not only cavalry. Many peoples rode horses. It was the combination of mobility, discipline, intelligence gathering, psychological warfare, and merit-based leadership. Mongol armies could move with astonishing speed. Riders often traveled with multiple horses, switching mounts to maintain momentum. Communication systems relayed information across vast distances. Commanders coordinated units with precision. They studied enemies, exploited divisions, adapted tactics, and struck where opponents were weakest. to slower, rigid states that could feel like fighting weather itself. Cities that resisted sometimes faced annihilation. Cities that surrendered could be spared and incorporated. The message spread quickly. Resist and risk destruction. Submit and live under new masters. Across Central Asia, Persia, and beyond, kingdoms fell. Trade routes were redrawn. Old powers collapsed. New networks formed under Mongol dominance. And China was watching. The Song Dynasty, especially after losing the north to the Jurchen Jin, had become centered in the south. This southern Song state remained wealthy, urban, cultured, and economically vibrant. Its cities bustled. Its navy was formidable. Its commerce flourished. Its scholars continued to shape intellectual life. But militarily, it lived under constant pressure. Before the Mongols could finish the Song, they first destroyed the Jin in northern China. This itself was a massive transformation. Then, after Genghis Khan's death, Mongol expansion continued under his successors. What one man began became a multi-generational machine. Eventually, the struggle turned fully toward the Song. This was not a quick collapse. The Song resisted fiercely and for decades. Their river systems, fortified cities, economic resources, and naval capabilities made conquest difficult. The south was not open grassland where cavalry could simply sweep to victory. It required siege warfare, logistics, adaptation, and persistence. The Mongols learned. That is another key to their success. They were not trapped by tradition. They absorbed engineers, administrators, siege specialists, artisans, and ideas from conquered peoples. If another civilization had a useful technique, the Mongols used it. Need siege engines? Learn from Chinese and Muslim engineers. Need tax systems? Use experienced administrators. Need maps, translators, craftsmen, doctors? Recruit them. This flexibility made them more dangerous than many purely destructive conquerors. They could break systems and then run them. By the reign of Kublai Khan, grandson of Genghis Khan, the Mongol project in China entered a new phase. Kublai understood that ruling China required more than winning battles. It required legitimacy, administration, and adaptation to Chinese political traditions. He founded the Yuan Dynasty in 1271, presenting Mongol rule in the language of Chinese dynastic succession. This was profound. The conquerors were no longer only outsiders attacking China. They were now claiming to be China's rightful rulers. Yet the Southern Song still survived. The final campaigns were brutal and prolonged. One of the most famous last moments came in 1279 at the Battle of Yamen, where Song loyalists made their final stand at sea. Defeat there ended the Song Dynasty. According to tradition, a loyal official carrying the child emperor leapt into the water rather than surrender. Whether remembered exactly or symbolically, the story captures the emotional truth. For many, a world had ended. China was now fully under Mongol rule. This raises an important question. If the Tang represented China at its classical imperial peak, and the Song represented China's commercial and technological brilliance, what did the Yuan represent? The answer is scale. The Mongol Empire became the largest contiguous land empire in history. Its domains stretched across enormous portions of Eurasia. Different khanates emerged, but the broader Mongol world connected regions that had rarely been linked so directly under related rule. For merchants, envoys, travelers, and ideas, this created extraordinary possibilities. The Old Silk Road experienced a new era of relative security, often called the Pax Mongolica. Movement across Eurasia became easier in many corridors than it had been for generations. Goods, technologies, artistic motifs, scientific knowledge, and religious communities moved through these networks. This did not mean peace everywhere or kindness everywhere. Mongol conquest had caused staggering destruction in many places. But after conquest came integration, and in that integrated world, famous travelers appeared. One of the best known is Marco Polo, the Venetian whose later accounts helped shape Europe's imagination of Asia. While debates remain over details of his narrative, the larger truth stands. The Mongol Age made long-distance contact more visible and consequential than before. Imagine how astonishing that world must have felt. A merchant in Venice hearing of paper money in China. A scholar in Persia encountering Chinese inventions. A craftsman in China exposed to designs from the Islamic world. A doctor learning remedies from distant traditions. A diplomat crossing lands once divided by countless hostile borders. The Mongol era did not invent globalization, but it accelerated a medieval version of it. And China, under the Yuan, stood at the center of much of that exchange. Kublai Khan built his capital at Dadu, near modern Beijing. The political center shifted northward in a way that would shape later dynasties too. Administration blended Mongol priorities with inherited Chinese institutions. Massive public works continued. Trade remained important. Maritime commerce expanded further. But ruling China was never simple. The Yuan hierarchy often favored Mongols and certain non-Han groups over the majority Chinese population. Ethnic categories shaped privilege and opportunity. Many Chinese elites resented foreign rule. Heavy taxation, corruption, and court struggles weakened legitimacy over time. And then, once again, familiar enemies returned. Floods, famine, economic strain, rebellion. No empire escapes the basic laws of human governance. If people suffer too long, if the state appears unjust or incapable, resistance grows. By the mid-14th century, uprisings spread. Among them rose a figure from humble origins whose life story would once again echo one of history's oldest patterns, from poverty to power. His name was Zhu Yuanzhang. He had known hunger. He had been a peasant, a monk, a survivor in a collapsing world. Like Temujin in a different context, hardship had trained him early. He joined rebellion, proved himself, outmaneuvered rivals, and eventually drove out the Yuan. In 1368, he founded the Ming Dynasty. The Mongols retreated north. China was ruled once more by a native dynasty. And this is where the long story from Tang to Song to Yuan becomes deeply meaningful. Each age believed itself permanent. None were. Each age solved problems left by the one before. Each created new problems for the next. The Tang showed how openness, military power, and cosmopolitan confidence could create greatness. The Song showed how commerce, learning, and innovation could sustain greatness differently. The Yuan showed how connectivity across continents could reshape the world, even through conquest. No chapter erased the last. Each inherited something. That is true in history, and it is true in life. You are shaped by what came before you, even when you choose a different path. A family may leave hardship and build education. A generation may leave war and build business. A person may leave failure and build discipline. The form changes. The legacy continues. China, after the Tang, was never simply after. It kept becoming something new. And the Ming Dynasty, born from rebellion against foreign rule, would soon attempt something breathtaking. To rebuild Chinese confidence so powerfully that giant treasure fleets would sail farther than any state-sponsored expeditions the world had yet seen. When foreign dynasties rule a land for generations, something changes inside the people who live there. Some adapt, some collaborate, some resist quietly, some wait, and many simply try to survive because survival is often more urgent than ideology. But deep beneath daily life, memory remains. Memory of how things once were. Memory of dignity. Memory of self-rule. That memory can sleep for years. Then suddenly, history turns and it wakes. That was the world from which the Ming Dynasty emerged. When the Yuan Dynasty weakened under corruption, economic stress, floods, factional struggle, and rebellion, people across China did not need to be convinced that change was necessary. They were already living that truth. Taxes hurt. Local order failed. Trust in the center was thin. And when trust disappears, power becomes vulnerable. Out of that unstable age rose Zhu Yuanzhang. His story remains one of the most dramatic social rises in world history because he began with almost nothing. He was born poor. He experienced famine. He lost family members. He spent time as a Buddhist novice and wandering survivor. He did not inherit privilege. He did not step naturally into command. He climbed from the bottom of society during one of its hardest moments. That makes his rise instantly relatable even centuries later. Many people know what it feels like to start behind others, to watch people born into comfort move faster, to carry burdens early in life, to wonder whether circumstances have already decided your future. Zhu Yuanzhang's life speaks to that universal human tension. Can someone for hardship really change everything? He did. Joining rebel movements during the collapse of Yuan rule, Zhu proved ruthless, strategic, patient, and highly capable. He defeated rivals one by one, built disciplined forces, secured territory, and presented himself not merely as another warlord, but as the restorer of order. In 1368, he founded the Ming Dynasty and became the Yuan Emperor. The symbolism was powerful. After nearly a century of Mongol rule, China once again had a native dynasty. For many, this was not just a political shift. It was emotional restoration. But rulers born from chaos often govern with memories of chaos. Hongwu never forgot insecurity. He had seen famine, rebellion, betrayal, and collapse. As emperor, he worked tirelessly to rebuild agriculture, restore tax systems, strengthen local administration, and repopulate devastated areas. He promoted farming, repaired infrastructure, and sought to anchor society in stability. Yet he also ruled with suspicion. Men who rise from danger sometimes continue to see danger everywhere. That can be useful in war. It can become destructive in peace. Hongwu distrusted officials, feared conspiracies, and carried out severe purges. Many were executed in campaigns against perceived threats. He centralized authority heavily and reduced the power of those who might challenge the throne. This, too, is relatable in a human way. Sometimes the habits that help people survive hardship later become barriers. The person who learned never to trust struggles to build relationships. The person who had to control everything cannot relax when life becomes safe. Strength and scar tissue often look similar. The Ming state that Hongwu built was powerful, disciplined, and deeply shaped by one man's experience. After him came another dramatic struggle for succession. And eventually the Yongle Emperor emerged as one of the most ambitious rulers in Chinese history. If Hongwu rebuilt the house, Yongle wanted the world to see it. He moved the capital to Beijing, a decision that would shape Chinese politics for centuries. There he expanded what became the Forbidden City, one of the most famous palace complexes on Earth. Monumental architecture, ceremonial order, and imperial grandeur once again became tools of statecraft. But Yongle's boldest vision was not on land. It was on the sea. For much of history, when people think of global exploration, they think first of European voyages in the 15th and 16th centuries. But before many of those journeys reached their peak, Ming China launch state sponsored expeditions of astonishing scale under the Admiral Zheng He. Zheng He himself had an extraordinary life. Born in Yunnan to a Muslim family, captured in war as a boy, brought into imperial service, and eventually rising to immense trust under Yongle, he became commander of one of history's most spectacular maritime enterprises. From 1405 onward, fleets under Zheng He sailed across the South China Sea, through Southeast Asia, across the Indian Ocean to South Asia, Arabia, and the East African coast. And these were not small ventures. The fleets included enormous treasure ships in later tradition, accompanied by support vessels, soldiers, translators, navigators, doctors, scribes, and diplomats. Even allowing for debates over exact ship sizes, the scale of organization was breathtaking. Imagine standing at a harbor as one of these fleets prepared to depart. Hundreds of sails, warehouses opening, officials checking cargo, sailors shouting orders, exotic gifts being loaded, horses, silk, porcelain, metals, ceremonial objects, tribute goods, fresh water, grain, maps, tools. The harbor packed with spectators trying to comprehend the size of what they were seeing. Then the ships pull away. For ordinary people, it must have looked like an empire itself floating across the sea. These voyages were not primarily colonial invasions in the later European sense. They were about diplomacy, prestige, trade networks, and projecting imperial presence. Rulers abroad were contacted. Tribute relationships were encouraged. Envoys exchanged gifts. Rare animals and luxury goods returned to China. Knowledge of distant regions expanded. One of the most famous symbols of these voyages was the giraffe brought from East Africa and presented at the Ming court. To many observers, such creatures seemed almost mythical. The world suddenly felt larger and more connected. This is one reason he still fascinates people today. His voyages represent possibility. They make us ask, what happens when a civilization chooses curiosity over fear? What happens when it has the resources to reach outward, not just in war, but in contact? And yet, just as the Tang had shown, greatness contains choices that can later reverse direction. After Yongle and the early Ming High Point, priorities changed. Court politics shifted. Threats on the northern frontier demanded attention. The immense cost of naval expeditions came under criticism. Confucian officials often favored agricultural stability and internal order over expensive overseas display. Gradually, the treasure voyages ended. Think about that moment carefully. One of the most advanced states on Earth had the capacity to sail farther, connect wider, and shape maritime history more deeply. And then it stepped back, not because it forgot how, because it chose differently. This is profoundly relatable. Sometimes in life, people reach a moment of great possibility and still retreat. Not from inability, but from competing pressures, fear, responsibility, cost, or changing values. A person may have talent to pursue a dream, but choose family duty. A company may have momentum, but become cautious. A nation may lead in one era and turn inward in the next. Potential alone never guarantees direction. The Ming did not collapse because voyages ended. China remained powerful, wealthy, and culturally vibrant for generations. Agriculture expanded further. Commerce grew. Literature flourished. Craftsmen produced world-famous porcelain. Urban life thrived. Population increased dramatically. Silver from global trade, especially later through links involving the Americas and maritime exchange, flowed into the Chinese economy. Markets deepened. Merchants gained influence. Regional specialization expanded. In many ways, everyday life under the Ming could be prosperous and dynamic. Yet familiar structural tensions slowly gathered. Population growth put pressure on land. Fiscal systems struggled. Court factions battled. Eunuchs and officials competed for influence. Border threats persisted. Corruption and inefficiency appeared in cycles. Environmental stress and colder climatic conditions in some periods worsen hardship. This pattern should feel familiar by now. No dynasty falls because of one cause. It is usually pressure upon pressure, weakness upon weakness, until one shock becomes too much. And there is another human lesson hidden here. Success can create comfort. Comfort can create complacency. Complacency can make adaptation slower when the world changes. The Ming inherited a strong civilization, vast resources, and deep legitimacy. But strength must be renewed, not merely inherited. That is true for families, careers, institutions, and nations. A parent's sacrifice can create opportunity for children, but children must still build their own discipline. A successful business cannot live forever on yesterday's reputation. A healthy relationship cannot survive on old memories alone. A great dynasty cannot rely only on founding glory. By the late Ming period, internal strains and external threats would collide. Rebellions would spread. Manchus beyond the northeastern frontier would rise. Beijing itself would fall into crisis. And once again, China would face a question it had answered many times before. When an old order breaks, what comes next? When the Ming Dynasty began to weaken, it did not collapse in a single moment. It did what all long-lived empires do in their final stages. It slowly lost its grip on itself. In some regions, officials still collected taxes and enforced law. In others, corruption hollowed out administration. In the countryside, farmers faced pressure from land concentration and local power holders. In the capital, court factions struggled for influence while distant provinces worried less and less about central authority. And beyond the walls of Ming China, in the cold grasslands and forested frontiers of the Northeast, a different story was unfolding. Far from the great cities of the Chinese heartland, beyond the familiar river systems and cultivated fields, lived peoples whose lives were shaped by harsher environments. Hunting, herding, seasonal movement, and tribal alliances defined survival. These were not unknown lands in Chinese history. For centuries, dynasties had interacted with steppe and forest peoples through trade, warfare, diplomacy, and tribute relationships. But now, among these groups, a new force was beginning to unify. In the forests of Manchuria, various Jurchen tribes gradually came under the leadership of a capable and ambitious chieftain named Nurhaci. His life began in a world where power was fragmented. Competing clans, shifting alliances, and local rivalries defined politics. There was no single authority, no unified identity, no central command that bound all Jurchen groups together. That fragmentation is important to understand because it mirrors a pattern seen many times in history. When a larger neighboring empire weakens, smaller frontier societies often begin to organize more tightly, partly for survival, partly for opportunity. Nurhaci was not born as an emperor. He was a tribal leader navigating a dangerous political landscape. Early in his life, he witnessed conflict, betrayal, and the constant instability of frontier politics. But he also recognized something important. Divided groups were vulnerable, but united groups could become powerful. Through alliances, military victories, negotiation, and organizational skill, he gradually brought many Jurchen clans under a single system of leadership. This was not just conquest, it was consolidation. He created structures that allowed different groups to act together, to coordinate armies, to follow shared rules, and to identify under a broader identity. This process is crucial because it shows how empires often begin long before they are called empires. First comes unity, then comes expansion. Nurhaci also adopted and adapted systems from neighboring civilizations, including administrative practices influenced by Chinese models. This blending of steppe and sedentary traditions is a recurring theme in Eurasian history. Frontier societies often do not reject the systems of neighboring empires. They study them, learn from them, and reshape them for their own use. As Ming China struggled with internal pressures, financial strain, court conflicts, local unrest, the northeastern frontier was becoming more organized, more disciplined, and more ambitious. After Nurhaci's death, leadership passed to his successors, most notably Hong Taiji, who continued the process of state formation. Under his rule, the Jurchen identity was increasingly redefined into what would become known as the Manchu identity, marking a transformation from tribal confederation into something closer to a structured imperial power. And importantly, a new dynasty name was proclaimed, the Qing. At first, this new power did not immediately dominate all of China. The Ming Dynasty still stood, still large, still deeply rooted in centuries of tradition, still controlling vast populations and productive lands. But it was weakened, and history often shows that when a large system weakens while a smaller system becomes more organized and disciplined, the balance can shift with surprising speed. Inside Ming territory, rebellions intensified. Economic stress grew. Local military forces became unreliable. In some regions, famine and disorder undermined confidence in the state. Among the most serious threats were peasant uprisings that emerged from desperation and collapse of local order. One of these movements, led by Li Zicheng, would eventually strike directly at the heart of Ming authority. Beijing fell. The last Ming emperor, facing the collapse of the system he had inherited, ended his own life rather than surrender. It was a moment of profound symbolic rupture. A dynasty that had restored native rule after Mongol domination now ended in internal crisis. But even then, China did not simply stabilize immediately. Instead, another force entered the scene. The Qing, led by Manchu armies from the northeast, moved southward into the vacuum of power. But their rise was not simply conquest by force alone. It involved alliances, defections, negotiations, and the complex use of existing administrative structures. Some Ming generals chose to support the Qing in exchange for order and position. Others resisted. The transition was not clean, and it was not peaceful. Eventually, however, Qing authority was established over the Central Plains. And here is where something important must be understood carefully. This was not just another conquest in a long chain of dynastic changes. It was also a transformation of imperial scale. The Qing Dynasty expanded China's territorial reach to an extent that in some ways surpassed earlier dynasties. Regions in the northwest, southwest, and borderlands were brought under more direct imperial control than before. The empire incorporated diverse ethnic groups, languages, and administrative regions into a complex structure of governance. But unlike earlier eras where expansion often meant outward projection from a single cultural core, the Qing developed a more layered system of rule. Different regions were managed in different ways depending on local conditions. Steppe, highland, agricultural plains, and frontier zones each required different approaches. Governance became more adaptive, but also more complex. At the center stood the emperor, now ruling from Beijing, continuing the legacy of imperial China while also embodying a new ruling identity shaped by Manchu origins and Chinese administrative tradition combined. One of the most remarkable aspects of Qing rule is that it demonstrates how empires evolve by absorbing and integrating systems they encounter, rather than remaining fixed in one form. The Qing did not erase the Chinese imperial tradition. They inherited it, used it, and expanded it. They maintained Confucian administrative structures, civil service examinations, taxation systems, and bureaucratic governance. At the same time, they preserved distinct identities and military traditions within their ruling elite. This balance between continuity and adaptation is one of the reasons the Qing dynasty lasted so long. For ordinary people living under Qing rule, daily life often continued in familiar patterns. Farming cycles remained. Markets operated. Families organized around agriculture, trade, education, and local society. Villages changed less dramatically than imperial capitals. For many, what mattered most was not which dynasty ruled, but whether harvests succeeded, taxes were bearable, and local stability held. And yet, the empire's scale continued to grow. Trade networks expanded across Asia. Internal commerce deepened further. Cities developed. Population increased significantly over time. Cultural production continued in literature, art, philosophy, and scholarship. Porcelain, textiles, painting, and craftsmanship reached high levels of refinement. The examination system still shaped elite careers, rewarding study and discipline. But beneath this apparent stability, the same long-term pattern that had shaped earlier dynasties still existed. Large empires face constant tension between center and periphery. They must balance control with flexibility. They must manage diversity without losing unity. They must respond to internal pressures and external challenges at the same time. They must prevent corruption while maintaining efficiency. They must adapt without losing identity. And as history had shown again and again, from Tang to Song to Yuan to Ming, the question was never whether an empire was strong at its height. The question was whether it could remain adaptable when conditions changed. The Qing would face that question too. But that is where this story pauses, because to understand what comes after requires a shift in perspective. Not just dynasties rising and falling, but something deeper about how civilizations move through time, how power changes shape, and how the world slowly begins to connect into a single system where no empire can stand entirely apart. For most of human history, civilizations rose and fell in relative separation. Even when empires were vast, their worlds were still bounded. Mountains slowed movement. Oceans made travel uncertain. Deserts and distance limited contact. Knowledge moved slowly, sometimes taking generations to cross continents. A discovery in one region might remain unknown in another for centuries. But over time, something began to change. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but steadily, like water carving stone. Trade routes became more active. Maritime travel became more reliable. Navigation improved. Technologies spread further and faster than before. Paper, printing, gunpowder, compasses, agricultural methods, medical knowledge, artistic styles, and religious ideas moved across Eurasia in ways earlier centuries could barely imagine. By the time the Qing Dynasty had consolidated its rule, China was no longer just part of a regional network in East Asia. It was deeply embedded in a much wider system of global exchange. But here's the important part. While goods and ideas were moving faster, political systems were still largely built on older assumptions. Empires like the Qing were designed for a world where power was primarily continental, where authority radiated from center, and where distance could still provide insulation from outside pressure. That model had worked for centuries. It had survived Mongol expansion, internal rebellions, dynastic transitions, and shifting frontiers. Yet history was quietly entering a new phase. At first, it did not look like a break from the past. It looked like continuation. Ports remained active. Markets grew. Craftsmen produced more goods. Scholars continued studying classical texts. Officials administered provinces. Farmers cultivated land. Life, on the surface, followed familiar rhythms. But beneath that continuity, the scale of interaction beyond China was expanding. Maritime trade in particular became more significant. Ships carried silk, porcelain, tea, and other goods outward. In return, silver and other resources increasingly flowed inward from distant regions through global trade networks. Coastal cities became busy hubs of exchange, filled with merchants, translators, dock workers, and officials managing customs and taxation. Think about what that means for a moment. For most of Tang, Song, Yuan, and Ming history, China had been one of the greatest centers of civilization in its own right, interacting with neighbors through structured networks like the Silk Road or regional maritime routes. But now, trade was becoming part of a broader interconnected system stretching across multiple continents at once. This shift did not erase older patterns. It layered new ones on top, and layered systems are always more complex to manage. Inside the Qing Empire, administrators still relied on traditional bureaucratic structures. The civil service examination system continued to shape elite advancement, emphasizing classical learning, moral philosophy, and governance principles rooted in long-standing traditions. This created continuity across centuries, linking Qing officials to Tang scholars and even earlier intellectual lineages. But the world outside was gradually changing in ways that did not always align with those inherited frameworks. Foreign powers, operating with different technologies, different administrative systems, and different military approaches, were becoming more present in maritime trade and coastal interactions. At first, these were limited contacts, merchants, envoys, and controlled exchanges. But over time, the intensity of contact increased. And with increased contact comes comparison. Comparison is one of history's most powerful forces. A society may feel stable until it sees another society operating differently. A military system may feel sufficient until it encounters a new kind of force. An economic structure may feel balanced until exposed to a larger network. An empire may feel central until it realizes it is one part of something much larger. The Qing court, like earlier dynasties, had to constantly balance internal stability with external awareness. That is never easy. Too much openness can create disruption. Too much isolation can create blindness. Every empire in history struggles to find that line. But before we move further, it is important to pause and recognize something deeper. This entire story, from the rise of Tang China, through Song innovation, Mongol unification, Ming restoration, and Qing consolidation, is not just a sequence of dynasties. It is a story about how societies respond to scale. The Tang responded to scale with expansion, cultural openness, and military projection across vast territories. The Song responded to scale with economic integration, technological development, and dense urban networks. The Yuan responded to scale with continental conquest and unprecedented connectivity across Eurasia. The Ming responded to scale with restoration, internal consolidation, and controlled outward projection. The Qing responded to scale with frontier expansion, layered governance, and administrative adaptation across diversity. Each system solved the problems left by the one before it. Each created new strengths. Each also created new vulnerabilities. And that is the key pattern. Civilizations do not move in straight lines. They move in responses. A crisis produces reform. Reform produces stability. Stability produces growth. Growth produces complexity. Complexity produces strain. Strain produces crisis again. This cycle is not unique to China. It appears across world history. But China's imperial sequence is one of the clearest long-term examples of it, precisely because of its continuity over such a long time. Now, returning to the Qing world. For most people living within the empire, life was still anchored in familiar realities. Villages mattered more than distant capitals. Harvests mattered more than imperial diplomacy. Local magistrates mattered more than court politics. Families planned their lives around agriculture, seasonal rhythms, education, and social obligations. A farmer in one province might live his entire life without ever seeing the capital. A craftsman might measure success not in imperial scale, but in whether his work was respected and sold. A student might devote years to classical study in hopes of passing examinations, entering official life, and improving his family's position. These personal experiences are essential to remember because empires are often described through the actions of rulers, but they are lived by ordinary people. And for them, stability is not abstract. It is everything. Yet the Qing system also depended on something larger than internal life. It depended on maintaining balance across a vast and diverse territory that included agricultural heartlands, frontier zones, nomadic regions, highland societies, and coastal trading centers. Managing such diversity required flexibility. Different regions could not always be governed in identical ways. Local conditions shaped administration. This adaptability helped the Qing maintain control over large areas for a long time. But adaptability also brings complexity, and complexity over generations becomes harder to manage. Meanwhile, across Eurasia, the pace of technological and economic change continued to accelerate. Long-distance communication improved. Maritime travel expanded. Commercial networks deepened. New resources entered global circulation. Knowledge spread more widely than ever before. This created a subtle but important shift. The world was becoming more interconnected than the political systems that governed it. That gap between connection and control is one of the most important dynamics in later history. Empires like the Qing were built in an earlier age, when distance still provided natural limits. But as those limits weakened, every state eventually faced a new challenge. How to respond to a world where events in one region could affect distant regions more quickly and more deeply than before. At first, that challenge is not obvious. It appears as trade, then competition, then comparison, then pressure, then transformation. But we are not yet at that final stage. For now, the Qing Empire still stands as one of the largest and most complex political systems on Earth. Its administration still functions. Its agricultural base still feeds millions. Its cities still thrive. Its scholars still study. Its officials still govern. Its frontiers still stretch across diverse landscapes. And within that structure, life continues. A child is born in a village and grows up learning family traditions. A student studies for years, hoping to pass examinations. A merchant travels between towns carrying goods and news. A family prays for good harvests and stable weather. An official records cases, collects taxes, and tries to maintain order. History, at this level, is not dramatic. It is repetitive, fragile, and human. But beneath that repetition, the world is slowly shifting again. Because the system that once contained continents is now beginning to encounter forces that do not fully fit within its old patterns. And when that happens in history, empires are forced to do something they have always struggled with. They must change not only how they rule, but how they understand the world itself. By the final stage of the Qing era, China was still a vast and deeply rooted civilization, but the nature of the world around had shifted in ways that earlier dynasties never had to face at the same scale. For thousands of years, Chinese imperial history had been shaped primarily by internal cycles: dynastic rise, consolidation, prosperity, strain, and renewal. External contacts existed, but they were usually absorbed into a world where China remained one of the central anchors of civilization in East Asia. Now, that balance was changing. What made this moment different was not simply that outsiders existed. It was that the speed, intensity, and technological nature of global interaction had increased. Maritime routes connected distant regions more frequently. New industrial capabilities began to appear in parts of the world outside the traditional agrarian empires. Military technology, trade systems, and political organization were evolving in ways that placed new kinds of pressure on older imperial structures. But even in this late stage, it is important not to reduce the Qing world to a simple story of decline. Real history is never that clean. Inside the empire, life continued with depth and complexity. Agriculture still formed the foundation of society. Villages still structured daily existence. Markets still linked regions together through trade. Cities remained centers of culture, administration, and craftsmanship. Scholars still studied classical texts. Families still pursued stability, education, and advancement through familiar systems that had existed for centuries. A farmer waking up in a river valley would still think about rain, soil, harvest, and taxes long before thinking about distant global shifts. A student preparing for examinations would still spend years memorizing texts, practicing writing, and hoping to pass into official service. A merchant would still calculate profit margins, transport routes, and seasonal risks. Life, in its immediate sense, continued as it always had. That continuity matters because it reminds us that empires are not just political entities. They are lived realities for millions of ordinary people whose concerns rarely appear in grand historical summaries. At the same time, the structure holding this world together was under increasing strain. Managing such a vast and diverse empire required constant adaptation, careful governance, and strong institutional coordination. When those systems functioned well, the empire remained stable. When they weakened, pressure accumulated across regions at different speeds. And as in earlier dynasties, multiple stresses eventually converged. Population growth placed pressure on land and resources. Local administrative challenges increased. Fiscal systems struggled to keep pace with expanding demands. Regional variations in wealth and development created uneven conditions. Natural disasters in different periods added further hardship. Local unrest occasionally escalated into larger conflicts that tested the state's capacity to respond. None of these factors alone ended the dynasty, but together, they created a situation where maintaining balance became increasingly difficult. And this is where the deeper pattern of the entire story becomes visible. From the Tang to the Song, from the Yuan to the Ming, and into the Qing, the same cycle appears again and again, even as each dynasty looks different on the surface. A new order emerges from crisis. It restores stability. It expands capacity. It reaches a peak of confidence and strength. It becomes increasingly complex over time. It faces internal and external pressures. It struggles to adapt quickly enough. And eventually, it transforms into something new. This is not just Chinese history. It is a pattern found in many long-lived civilizations. But in China, the continuity of the imperial system makes the pattern especially clear. Because even when dynasties ended, the civilization itself did not reset. Institutions, cultural traditions, administrative ideas, and social values often carried forward into the next era in new forms. And that is one of the most important truths of this entire story. Empires end. Civilizations evolve. When the Qing Dynasty finally came to its end in the early 20th century, it marked the conclusion of a long imperial system that had lasted for millennia. The formal structure of dynastic rule, with emperors at the center of a mandate of heaven worldview, came to a close. But the cultural, social, and historical foundations built across all those earlier dynasties did not disappear. The legacy of Tang openness, Song innovation, Yuan connectivity, Ming restoration, and Qing administrative scale remained embedded in language, identity, institutions, and historical memory. Looking back across this entire journey, from the rise of the Tang Dynasty after the collapse of the Sui, to the golden age of Chang'an, to the Song's rise of commerce and innovation, to the Mongol unification of Eurasia, to the Ming voyages across the oceans, to the Qing's final imperial consolidation, we are not just watching rulers and battles. We are watching how a civilization continuously rebuilt itself under changing conditions. And that brings us to the final reflection. Why do these cycles matter to someone watching today? Because they're not just about ancient emperors or distant empires. They're about patterns that still exist in human life at every scale. A person can experience rise, stability, success, complexity, and transformation. A family can build prosperity over generations, then face change and adaptation. A company can dominate a market, then struggle when conditions shift. A nation can reach a peak, then be forced to redefine itself in a new era. The names change, the scale changes, the actors change, but the underlying dynamics, growth, pressure, adaptation, and renewal remain recognizable. That is why the story of Tang, Song, Yuan, Ming, and Qing continues to matter. Not because it is a closed chapter of the past, but because it reflects something ongoing in human civilization. The constant need to adapt when the world changes faster than the systems built to manage it. And if there is one final takeaway from this long journey through Chinese imperial history, it is this. Greatness is not only measured by how high a civilization rises, but by how many times it can transform itself and continue forward in new forms. The Tang showed what unity and cultural brilliance can create. The Song showed what innovation and economic depth can achieve. The Yuan showed how vast connections can reshape the world. The Ming showed how restoration can rebuild identity and confidence. The Qing showed how long endurance and adaptation can sustain a system across centuries. And after all of them, China did not disappear. It continued, changed, reshaped, and transformed, but still moving forward through history. Because in the end, the Real story was never just about dynasties rising and falling. It was about a civilization learning again and again how to survive the fall, rebuild from the break, and step into whatever comes next.